David Carter, a 35-year-old software engineer, thought he had it all: the perfect life, a loving wife named Laura, and two bright-eyed children, Ella and Liam. Their 12-year marriage seemed like the kind of union most people envied. Laura, a 33-year-old marketing executive, was ambitious and driven, swiftly climbing the corporate ladder. Together, they managed the chaos of work and parenting, balancing everything with a sense of ease. It seemed like the ideal partnership, one built on love, trust, and shared dreams. But something had started to feel off lately. David couldn't put his finger on it, but subtle cracks were beginning to form in their seemingly perfect life. Laura's work had become more demanding, and her hours stretched longer. Her phone buzzed constantly, yet she never shared the messages with David. He told himself it was just work stress. After all, Laura had a lot on her plate. Still, despite his rationalization, the woman he once knew, the warm, affectionate partner, was slipping away from him. The laughter that used to fill their home felt hollow now, her smiles were no longer as bright, and a distance had crept between them. David didn't want to believe it, but his gut told him something was wrong. He ignored his instincts, clinging to the history they had, the family they built, their active social life, and their shared memories of love. Yet, life as he knew it was about to crumble in ways he couldn't imagine. One ordinary evening, David's world shifted. It was a Friday night, and after a family dinner, Ella and Liam ran off to play. David stayed behind to clear the table while Laura scrolled through her phone, her face bathed in the soft glow of the screen. Then, her phone buzzed, and a message notification popped up. It wasn't the message itself that caught David's attention, but the name attached to it, Greg Hensley. Greg, her boss, had been mentioned a few times before, a respected figure at her company. But the message he sent a jolt through David's chest. "Missing our talks already. Wish you were here." Why would a boss say something like that? David's heart sank, his mind racing. As soon as Laura saw him glance at her phone, she quickly flipped it face down, her eyes betraying a nervous smile. "Work never stops," she brushed off. But that smile, it didn't reach her eyes. That night, David couldn't sleep. The words of that message echoed in his mind, and he searched for any innocent explanation. None came. He wondered if he was just being paranoid, but deep down, he felt something darker at play. The next few days only deepened his unease. He began noticing things he hadn't before: how Laura would step out to answer calls, how she clung to her phone like a lifeline, how the distance between them grew with each passing day. The perfect life he thought they shared was beginning to crack, and David couldn't shake the feeling that the cracks were leading to something far worse. Every late-night text, every secret phone call, every work trip added weight to the knot in David's stomach. He hated the idea of invading her privacy, but he couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, as Laura stepped into the shower, her phone was left unattended on the kitchen counter. David hesitated, his heart pounding. Should he do this? It felt wrong, like crossing an invisible line. But what if she had already crossed it? With trembling hands, he unlocked her phone using the passcode he'd seen her enter countless times. His stomach churned with guilt and fear. Navigating to her messages, he found what he was looking for: an entire thread with Greg Hensley. At first glance, it seemed innocent enough: work updates, office chatter. But as he scrolled deeper, the messages became more personal. Inside jokes, playful teasing, and then photos. Nothing explicit, but the intimacy between them was undeniable. A picture of Laura smiling, holding a coffee mug, captioned, "Morning meetings aren't so bad when they start with this." David felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath him. He screenshotted the messages and emailed them to himself. He didn't know what he would do with the evidence yet, but one thing was clear: his suspicions were no longer just a product of his overactive mind. The days that followed were filled with tension. David's behavior became more distant, withdrawn, as he silently observed Laura, looking for more signs of deceit. She noticed the change and asked if everything was okay. He forced a smile, lying, "Yeah, just work stress." But inside, he was unraveling, desperately trying to figure out his next move. He couldn't keep pretending, but he wasn't ready to confront her without undeniable proof. That's when David made a decision that seemed impossible. He hired a private investigator. It felt like a betrayal, but it was a step he felt he had to take. The investigator worked quickly, tailing Laura on her next business trip. A week later, David received an envelope with photos that crushed any remaining hope he had. The images showed Laura and Greg together, photos of the two of them, side by side, their closeness unmistakable. David's world had shattered. What he feared most had come to fruition, and there was no turning back. The weight of the photos in the envelope pressed down on David's chest as he gazed at each one, his hands trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. He could hardly believe the images before him: Laura and Greg, laughing in a dimly lit bar, sharing drinks as if they had no care in the world. The next set of photos showed them entering a hotel together late at night, and then leaving the next morning. David sat in silence, the truth sinking in, tearing through him like a storm. There was no more room for doubt, no more benefit of the doubt to give. It was time to confront Laura. That evening, he waited for her to return home. The envelope of damning evidence sat on the coffee table, its presence heavy in the air. When Laura walked in, she immediately sensed the tension. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky, uncertain. "Sit down," David replied, his tone calm but cold. Laura hesitated before sitting across from him, her heart racing, knowing something was wrong. David slid the envelope toward her, watching as she opened it, her face paling as she sifted through the photos. Her hands began to tremble. "David, I can explain," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Explain what?" David's voice cracked, his emotions threatening to burst through. "That you've been lying to me? That you've been cheating on me with your boss?" Laura burst into tears, her hands covering her face in anguish. "It was a mistake," she sobbed. "It didn't mean anything. I was stressed, and it just happened. Please, David, don't do this." But David had heard enough. For weeks, he had clung to hope, hoping that he was wrong, that there was some explanation that could make sense of this. But now, sitting across from the woman he thought he knew, he realized the painful truth: their marriage had already been shattered beyond repair. "I can't do this anymore, Laura," he said quietly, standing up and walking away. Behind him, Laura's sobs echoed through the room, but David didn't look back. The days that followed were a blur for David. The betrayal had cut deeper than he could have ever imagined. Every corner of their home held memories of a life he once thought was secure, a life now shattered. Laura begged him for a chance to explain, to repair the damage, but her words felt hollow. How could someone who had shared his bed, his life, and the future of their children betray him so completely? David struggled to keep his emotions in check around Ella and Liam. They were too young to understand the turmoil that was tearing their family apart. At night, when the kids were asleep, David would sit alone in the dark, replaying every moment, every sign he had missed. The weight of his emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, threatened to consume him. The betrayal didn't just hurt, it made him question everything. Was he not enough? Had their entire marriage been a lie? Friends and family noticed his withdrawn demeanor, but David wasn't ready to share his pain with anyone. Instead, he threw himself into work, hoping the distraction would numb the ache. But the pain didn't fade. Every time Laura tried to talk to him, every time she apologized, it only made the wound feel fresher. Trust, he realized, wasn't just broken, it was obliterated. And while David had always thought of himself as forgiving, this wound was too deep to heal. There was no way forward without a final, decisive conversation. After days of avoidance, David called Laura to the living room one evening. The kids were out with a babysitter, leaving the two of them alone in the house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth. Laura sat across from him, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She had been waiting for this moment, knowing it was inevitable. "David, please," she began, but he held up a hand, stopping her before she could speak further. "I need to say this," David said, his voice steady but cold. "I loved you, Laura. I trusted you with everything. My heart, my life, my children's happiness. And you threw it all away for what? Some meaningless fling." "It wasn't meaningless," Laura blurted out, then immediately regretted her words. The room fell silent, the weight of her admission pressing down on both of them. David clenched his fists, fighting to maintain his composure. "So it wasn't just a mistake," he said quietly. "It was a choice. A deliberate choice you made over and over again." Laura broke down, tears streaming down her face. "I was lonely, David. You were always so busy, so focused on work. I didn't mean for this to happen. But Greg, He made me feel seen." Her words struck David like a dagger, each one twisting the knife deeper into his already bleeding heart. "Don't you dare put this on me," he said, his voice rising with anger. "I've been working to give us a good life. For you. For the kids. And while I was doing that, you were sneaking around with him. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us?" "I'll do anything to fix this," Laura begged, desperation in her voice. "Please, David. I'll go to counseling. I'll quit my job. Whatever it takes." David shook his head, the finality of his decision settling in. "Some things can't be fixed, Laura. You broke something that can't be put back together." With those words, David stood up and walked out of the room, leaving Laura sobbing on the couch. For the first time since discovering the affair, he felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about betrayal, it was about self-respect. And he wasn't willing to sacrifice that anymore. The days that followed were a fog for David, haunted by the image of Laura's tear-streaked face, her desperate apologies, and her promises of reconciliation. But deep in his heart, something had shifted permanently. The love he once had for her was tainted, poisoned by lies and betrayal. As the days passed, David became more certain that divorce was the only way forward. He consulted a lawyer, the words "irreconcilable differences" echoing in his mind like a mantra. For weeks, he had wondered if there was a way to salvage the relationship, but the truth had become clear. Laura had chosen a different path, and David couldn't continue pretending everything was fine. Ella had started asking why Mommy and Daddy weren't talking as much, and David knew he couldn't keep up the charade for much longer. The life he had once built with Laura was crumbling, and there was no turning back. The decision to get a divorce shattered David's heart, but deep down, he knew it was necessary. He had to protect his own well-being, and ultimately, the well-being of his children. He couldn't bear the thought of Ella and Liam growing up in an environment where the love between their parents had long since vanished. That night, David sat alone with the divorce papers in his hands, the weight of the moment heavy in his chest. His mind raced, but his decision was clear. The next day, he would serve Laura the divorce papers. It felt surreal, like he was playing a role in someone else's life, not his own. Yet, he knew it was the right thing to do. The following day, he arranged to meet Laura in the lobby of a quiet hotel, neutral ground, away from the charged atmosphere of their home. He couldn't bear to do this within the walls that had once held so many memories. The sterile, emotionless setting of the hotel lobby felt fitting, distancing the moment from the life they had built together. Laura arrived, her face a mixture of anticipation and fear. She thought they were going to have a conversation, perhaps to patch things up, but David had already made his decision. As she walked toward him, he handed her a small, sealed envelope. "David," Laura asked, her voice trembling. "What is this?" David stood still, his face calm, almost cold. "It's over, Laura," he said simply, his voice steady. Her face crumpled in disbelief. "You're really doing this? You're going to divorce me?" "Yes," he said, his voice unwavering. "I am." The weight of his words hit her like a blow. She opened the envelope, her hands shaking as she scanned the divorce papers. No, David, you can't do this. You can't just throw away everything we've built." But David had already come to terms with the truth. "I didn't throw anything away, Laura." "You did," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I can't live with a lie anymore. I'm not going to pretend that what's between us is real. I'm done." Laura's tears flowed freely now, her sobs echoing through the quiet lobby. "I'm sorry, David. I'm so sorry," she pleaded, but David couldn't allow himself to feel pity for her anymore. "I know you are," he said, his voice flat. "But sorry doesn't fix this. It doesn't change the fact that you betrayed me in the worst way possible. And I'm done with that." With that, David turned and walked away, leaving Laura alone with the papers that sealed the end of their marriage. As he stepped outside into the cold air, he took a deep breath. A strange sense of relief washed over him, mixed with sorrow. He had done what he needed to do, for himself, for his future. There would be more difficult conversations ahead, co-parenting, final arrangements, but for now, David knew one thing for sure. He was done living in the shadow of someone else's mistakes. It was time to rebuild. In the weeks that followed, as the divorce papers were served, David found himself caught in a relentless storm of emotions. While part of him felt a strange sense of relief from finally taking control of his life, another part of him grieved the family he had lost. He was still processing the fact that the woman he had envisioned growing old with had betrayed him so deeply. But now, he had to focus on the future, on rebuilding himself and maintaining a sense of normalcy for Ella and Liam. The kids were the hardest part. They didn't fully understand what was happening, only that Mommy and Daddy weren't living together anymore. The questions came, ones that David couldn't easily answer. Why did Mommy leave? Where is she going now? The answers were difficult to give, but David promised himself that he would never lie to them. Mommy made some choices that hurt our family, he explained gently. But we're still a family, just in a different way. Co-parenting with Laura proved to be a difficult adjustment. Laura had apologized, trying to act as though nothing had changed, but David couldn't shake the feeling that every interaction with her was tainted by the past. Their conversations, which revolved around the kids and their shared responsibilities, always seemed to carry an unspoken tension. Laura seemed to want to repair what they had lost, but David couldn't forget the betrayal that had irrevocably altered everything. Though the pain of the divorce and the broken trust still lingered, David slowly began to rebuild his life. He returned to hobbies he had neglected for years and spent more time with friends, rediscovering the parts of himself that had been buried under the weight of his marriage. Therapy helped, too. David learned to focus on healing, not just for his children's sake, but for his own. He couldn't change the past, but he could reshape his future. Several months later, David found himself in a place he never thought he'd be, not just surviving, but truly moving on. He had taken control of his life again. Though memories of Laura and their family still lingered, they no longer held him captive. He was learning to enjoy his independence, rediscovering who he was outside of his marriage. One day, while picking Ella and Liam up from school, David spotted a familiar face across the parking lot, a woman he had met through mutual friends a few months earlier. Her name was Karen. She was kind, funny, and understanding, having been through her own difficult experiences. They had enjoyed casual outings together, but now, the possibility of something more seemed real. David wasn't sure if he was ready for a relationship just yet, but as he smiled at Karen from across the lot, he realized that, for the first time in months, he was open to the idea of happiness again. There was still a lot of healing to be done, but David knew that life wasn't about waiting for the past to heal. It was about moving forward, even when the future seemed uncertain. With Ella and Liam by his side, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. They were a family again, just not the one he had once envisioned. David realized that while the past had shaped him, it didn't have to define his future. He was stronger now, wiser, and ready for whatever came next.